What if the civilizations we call ancient were themselves looking back across a gulf of time, trying to remember? What if 12,000 years ago, long before the first Maya city rose from the jungle, there were already people building, gathering, watching the stars, and leaving behind just enough to make us wonder? All you have to do to get the answers to these questions is subscribe and hit like on this video. It genuinely motivates me to work harder and make the content even better. So get comfy, brew yourself a cup of tea, and enjoy. 12,000 years. It's a number that sits at the edge of what we can easily imagine. It's not mythical, it's not symbolic. It's a real span of time measured in layers of earth, in shifts of climate, in the slow rewriting of coastlines and forests. 12,000 years ago, the world was in the middle of a transformation. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers were retreating. Sea levels were rising, swallowing old shorelines, old river mouths, old places where people might have lived. The land itself was changing shape, and in that changing world, people were changing too. They were moving, adapting, experimenting, building new ways of life in new landscapes. Some were still following herds, still living as their ancestors had for tens of thousands of years, but others were beginning to settle, to return to the same places season after season, to plant seeds, to build structures that might last longer than a single lifetime, to gather not just for survival, but for something else, for ceremony, for memory, for the slow work of turning knowledge into tradition. This is not a story about a single lost civilization. It's not a story about one place, one people, one dramatic origin. It's a story about a threshold, a doorway in time, a moment when many different groups, in many different regions, were beginning to cross from one kind of existence into another. And in the Americas, this threshold opens onto a long, complex, interconnected history that eventually leads to the Maya, to the great city builders of Mesoamerica, to the astronomers and scribes who would turn memory into writing, time into calendars, and the movements of the heavens into prophecy. But 12,000 years before the Maya, what was already there? The answer is not hidden in conspiracy. It's not locked away in forbidden archives. It's written in stone, in soil, in the patient work of archaeologists who dig slowly, carefully, layer by layer. It's written in the things people left behind, deliberately or accidentally. Tools, hearths, post holes, shells, seeds, bones, the quiet debris of everyday existence, and sometimes, in rare moments, something more. A carved stone, a circular plaza, a platform built from earth and rock, oriented toward the solstice sunrise. These are not sensational discoveries. They are small signals, fragments, but when you step back and look at them together, across thousands of miles and thousands of years, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a single civilization, not a master plan, but a web of human presence, human ingenuity, human memory, stretching back far deeper than the familiar names we learned in school. So let us begin at the threshold. Let us stand at the edge of 12,000 years and look back, not with certainty, not with grand claims, but with curiosity, with respect for what we don't know, and with attention to the quiet clues that remain. This is a story told in fragments, in gaps, in silences. But those silences are not empty. They are full of possibility, and they begin with a question. What does it mean when we say 12,000 years? It's easy to let large numbers blur together. 10,000, 12,000, 15,000. They all sound ancient. They all feel impossibly distant. But 12,000 years is not arbitrary. It's a marker, a point on the timeline where something shifts, Archaeologists call it the terminal Pleistocene and the early Holocene, the end of the last glacial period, the beginning of the current interglacial age. For most of us, those terms are abstract. But for the people living through it, this was a world in motion. The climate was warming. Ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for millennia were melting. Rivers were changing course. Lakes were forming and drying. Forests were spreading into lands that had been tundra. Animals were migrating, adapting, or disappearing entirely. And humans were responding. In the Americas, this was the era when Paleo-Indian peoples, the descendants of those who had first entered the continents thousands of years earlier, were diversifying. They were no longer just following mammoth herds. The megafauna were vanishing, some hunted to extinction, others lost to climate change, habitat loss, disease. People were turning to smaller game, to fishing, to gathering wild plants in new ways. They were learning the rhythms of different ecosystems. Coastal peoples were learning the tides, the seasonal movements of fish and shellfish. Inland peoples were learning the cycles of nut harvests, the migrations of deer, the locations of quarries where good stone could be found. This was not a sudden revolution. It was a slow, patient accumulation of knowledge. Trial and error, success and failure. Some groups stayed mobile, others began to linger in places that offered abundance. River valleys, coastal estuaries, lake shores, anywhere that resources were predictable enough to support longer stays. And in a few places, at a few sites, the archaeological record begins to show something new. Not just campsites, not just seasonal shelters, but something more deliberate, more communal. Structures built with effort, spaces arranged with care. Evidence of people returning to the same spot, year after year, generation after generation, building on top of older layers, creating a kind of continuity. One of the earliest known examples of this shift is far from the Maya world, but it offers a window into what was possible 12,000 years ago. In the highlands of Anatolia, in what is now southeastern Turkey, there is a site called Göbekli Tepe. It's a series of circular stone enclosures, some as old as 11,500 years, built by people who were not yet fully sedentary farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, or at least on the cusp of farming, and yet they were capable of organizing labor, of carving massive stone pillars, of creating a ceremonial space that required planning, coordination, and shared purpose. Why mention this here in a story about the Americas? Because it shows what humans were capable of at this moment in time. It shows that 12,000 years ago, in different parts of the world, people were beginning to experiment with new forms of social organization, with ritual architecture, with the deliberate creation of sacred space. And if it was happening in Anatolia, it is not unreasonable to ask, could something similar have been happening elsewhere? Could it have been happening in the Americas? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. The Americas are vast. Much of the landscape has changed. Sea levels have risen more than 300 feet since the end of the last ice age. Entire coastlines where people might have lived are now underwater. Rivers have shifted. Forests have grown over old sites. Erosion, flooding, volcanic activity, the simple passage of time, all of these erase evidence. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and there are clues. Let us begin with the idea of settlement, of people choosing to stay in one place or to return to the same place repeatedly. This is one of the earliest signs of a shift from mobile hunter-gathering to something more complex. Not full-blown agriculture, not cities, but proto-villages, base camps, seasonal gathering sites that gradually become more permanent. In North America, there are sites that show this pattern emerging around 10 to 12,000 years ago. In the Great Basin, in the deserts of what is now Nevada and Utah, there are caves and rock shelters where people lived intermittently for thousands of years. The layers of habitation are deep. Fire pits, tools, basketry fragments, evidence of careful resource management, of knowing the land intimately. In the southeast, along the rivers and coastal plains, there are shell middens, heaps of discarded shellfish shells that begin to accumulate during this period. These middens are not just garbage heaps. They are markers of repeated occupation, of people returning to the same estuaries, the same riverbanks, to harvest oysters, clams, mussels. Over centuries, these middens grow into mounds, some as large as small hills. They become landmarks, gathering places, perhaps even ceremonial sites. In the Pacific Northwest, along the rivers that drain into the ocean, there are sites where salmon fishing becomes central to life. The salmon runs are predictable, abundant. They allow people to gather in large numbers, to process and store food, to spend time on activities other than immediate survival. Trade, art, ritual, the beginnings of social complexity. None of these are cities. None of these are writing systems or monumental architecture in the way we associate with the Maya. But they are foundations. They are experiments in staying, in accumulating, in building continuity. And in Mesoamerica, the region that will eventually become the heartland of the Maya, there are signs of similar processes beginning. The earliest evidence is sparse, fragile, but it exists. In the highlands of central Mexico, there are sites like Tlapacoya, where human activity has been dated to around 12,000 years ago. Stone tools, hearths, evidence of hunting and gathering. In the Tehuacan Valley, archaeologists have found evidence of early plant domestication, the slow, patient process of selecting wild plants for favorable traits beginning around 10,000 years ago. Squash, beans, eventually maize. These are not sudden inventions. They are gradual shifts, people experimenting with seeds, noticing which plants grow better, saving the best seeds for the next season. This is not agriculture as we think of it. Not yet. But it is the beginning of a relationship with the land that will eventually allow for permanent villages, for surplus food, for specialization, for all the things that make complex societies possible. In the lowlands, along the coasts, the evidence is even harder to find. Sea level rise has drowned the old shorelines. Any coastal settlements from 12,000 years ago are now deep underwater, inaccessible, erased from the surface record. This is one of the great frustrations of archaeology. The places where people would most likely have lived, near water, near abundant resources, are the places most likely to be lost. But there are hints. In Belize, underwater archaeologists have found evidence of ancient cave systems now submerged, where Paleo-Indian peoples ventured to mine ochre, a red pigment used for ritual purposes. The caves were dry then. The sea was lower. People could walk in, carrying torches, descending into the darkness to extract this precious material. Bones have been found in these caves, human remains, tools, evidence of deliberate activity, of purpose. And if people were venturing into caves for ochre, what else were they doing? Where else were they living? What other sites are now lost beneath the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific? We will never know the full extent of human presence in the Americas 12,000 years ago. too much is gone. But what remains suggests a world that was far more active, far more interconnected than we once imagined. Let us turn now to another kind of clue. Not settlements, but structures. Not everyday habitation, but something built with a different purpose. Something that required more effort than simple survival would demand. Something ceremonial, communal, sacred. This is where the story becomes more speculative, but also more intriguing. In various parts of the Americas, there are sites that seem to show early forms of ritual architecture. Not pyramids, not temples in the later sense, but earthworks, stone circles, platforms, places that were clearly set apart, clearly intended for gatherings, for ceremony, for marking time. One of the most striking examples is in Louisiana, in the lower Mississippi Valley. There, at a site called Watson Break, archaeologists have found a complex of earthen mounds arranged in an oval pattern, connected by ridges. Radiocarbon dating places the construction of these mounds at around 5,400 years ago. That's still ancient, still thousands of years before the Maya, but not quite 12,000. But here's the important part. Watson Break was not built by farmers. It was built by hunter-gatherers, people who were still largely mobile, still dependent on wild resources. And yet they organized the labor to move thousands of tons of earth, to create a ceremonial landscape that endured for centuries. If hunter-gatherers 6,000 years ago could do this, is it possible that earlier peoples, 12,000 years ago, were doing something similar? Something we haven't found yet or haven't recognized? In Brazil, in the Amazon basin, there are earthworks that have only recently been discovered, thanks to deforestation revealing what was hidden beneath the forest canopy. Geometric patterns, ditches and embankments forming circles, squares, hexagons. Some of these structures are over 2,000 years old, but their discovery has prompted researchers to ask, how much older might this tradition be? How far back does the impulse to shape the land, to create ceremonial space, extend? The Amazon has long been seen as a pristine wilderness, untouched by human hands until recent centuries. But that view is changing. Evidence is accumulating that the Amazon was home to large, complex societies long before European contact. Societies that managed the forest, that cultivated certain tree species, that built earthworks and settlements. And if these societies were thriving 2,000, 3,000 years ago, they did not appear out of nowhere. They had predecessors, ancestors who learned, who experimented, who passed on knowledge. How far back does that chain of knowledge go? Could it go back 12,000 years? We don't have proof. We have questions, but questions are not weakness. Questions are the beginning of understanding. Let us consider another kind of clue. Not where people lived or what they built, but what they knew, the skills they possessed, the knowledge they carried. 12,000 years ago, the people of the Americas were not primitive. That word is a trap, a relic of old thinking. They were fully modern humans, with the same cognitive abilities as anyone alive today. They were skilled observers of their environment. They understood the seasons, the movements of animals, the properties of plants. They knew how to make fire, how to craft tools, how to navigate by the stars, and in some cases, they knew more. There is evidence, scattered across the Americas, of early astronomical knowledge, of people paying attention to the sky, not just as a backdrop, but as a calendar, a guide, a source of meaning. The Maya are famous for their astronomy, their calendar systems, their ability to predict eclipses, their obsession with Venus and its cycles. But they did not invent these interests. They inherited them, they refined them, they turned them into something systematic, something written down, but the underlying impulse, to watch the sky, to find patterns, to mark time, is far older. At Chaco Canyon, in what is now New Mexico, there are structures built around 1,000 years ago that show clear astronomical alignments. Buildings oriented to the solstices, windows that frame the sunrise on specific days. This is not the Maya. This is a different culture in a different region. But the same impulse is there, and if it was there 1,000 years ago, and among the Maya 2,000 years ago, could it have been there even earlier? In the Andes, in the highlands of Peru, there are sites that show early forms of monumental architecture and astronomical observation. Caral, one of the oldest cities in the Americas, dates to around 5,000 years ago. Its people built pyramids, plazas, sunken circular courtyards. They had no writing, no pottery, but they had social complexity, trade networks, and a clear sense of sacred space. And Caral, too, did not appear out of nowhere. It had predecessors, pre-ceramic sites, pre-urban sites, places where people were gathering, building, experimenting. How far back does that chain go? Could it go back to the threshold, to 12,000 years? The Maya themselves left clues about their own sense of deep time. Their long count calendar, which measures time in vast cycles, speaks of dates far in the past, far beyond the founding of their cities. Some of these dates are mythological, tied to creation stories, but others may reflect a cultural memory, a sense that their civilization was part of something older, something that stretched back through generations beyond counting. The Maya did not see themselves as the beginning. They saw themselves as heirs, heirs to knowledge, heirs to tradition, heirs to a land that had been shaped, inhabited, remembered for far longer than any individual could grasp. And if they saw themselves that way, perhaps we should take them seriously. But let us be careful. Let us not leap from fragments to fantasies. Let us not fill the gaps with speculation and call it history. The truth is, we have very little direct evidence of what was happening in Mesoamerica 12,000 years ago. We have stone tools, we have traces of camps, we have the slow beginnings of plant domestication. But we do not have cities. We do not have writing. We do not have clear proof of large-scale organization or monumental construction. What we have is context and possibility. The context is this. 12,000 years ago, humans around the world were capable of remarkable things. In the Fertile Crescent, they were beginning to domesticate wheat and barley. In East Asia, they were experimenting with rice. In the highlands of New Guinea, they were managing taro and yam gardens. These were not isolated accidents. These were parallel developments driven by similar environmental pressures, similar human ingenuity. And in the Americas, people were responding to the same moment in history. They were adapting to the end of the Ice Age. They were learning new landscapes. They were experimenting with new strategies for survival and flourishing. The possibility is this. In some places, at some sites now lost or undiscovered, people were doing more than surviving. They were gathering, they were building, they were creating traditions that would be passed down, refined, transformed over thousands of years, eventually flowering into the complex societies we know from the archaeological record. The Maya, the Olmec, the Zapotec, the people of Teotihuacan, the cultures of the Gulf Coast, the highlands, the Pacific slope. All of them had deep roots. All of them inherited knowledge from ancestors who came before. And those ancestors, in turn, had ancestors. How far back does the chain go? We stand at the threshold of 12,000 years, and we look back, and we see shadows, fragments, hints of presence. But we do not see the whole picture. Perhaps we never will. But that does not mean the picture does not exist. It simply means that much of it is hidden, drowned, eroded, overgrown, waiting, and so we continue to search. We continue to dig. We continue to ask questions, not because we expect easy answers, but because the questions themselves are valuable. They remind us that history is deeper than we thought, that the past is not a simple story with a clear beginning, that the people who came before us were not primitive, not simple, not less than us. They were us, in a different time, with different challenges and different solutions, and they left behind enough to make us wonder, enough to make us imagine what else might be out there, still waiting to be found, enough to stand at the threshold of 12,000 years and feel the weight of all that came before. This is where we begin, not with certainty, not with grand claims, but with respect for the unknown, with attention to the fragments, with a willingness to sit with mystery, to let it unfold slowly, to follow the clues wherever they lead. In the next part of this journey, we will look more closely at those clues, at the gaps in the record and what they might mean, at the different theories, the different interpretations, the different ways researchers are trying to make sense of this distant past. But for now, let us simply hold the question. What was already there 12,000 years before the Maya? The answer is not simple. It may never be complete, but it is worth seeking, and it begins with a willingness to listen to the silence and to hear what it might be trying to say. 12,000 years, a threshold, a doorway, a moment when the world was changing and people were changing with it. And in the Americas, in the lands that would one day be shaped by the Maya and so many others, there were already people living, thinking, building, remembering. We do not know their names. We do not know their languages. We do not know their stories. But they were there. And their presence echoes forward through the millennia, reaching us now as questions, as fragments, as quiet invitations to wonder. This is their story, or at least as much of it as we can glimpse. Let us continue. There is a shelf in the library of human history, and it is mostly empty. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened left few traces, or because the traces that were left have been lost to time, to water, to the patient work of erosion and decay. This is the nature of deep time. The farther back we look, the less we can see. Not because the past was simpler or less full of life, but because the materials of ordinary existence are fragile. Wood rots, fiber decays, leather crumbles. Even stone, given enough time and weather, can be worn away to nothing. What survives is accidental. A tool dropped into a peat bog, preserved by the oxygen-free water. A hearth buried by a landslide, sealed away from the air. A shell midden that grows so large, so compacted, that it becomes almost stone-like in its durability. A carved stone left in a dry cave, where moisture and roots cannot reach it. These are the fragments we have, and from these fragments, we try to reconstruct entire worlds. It is important to understand this. When we talk about what happened 12,000 years ago, we are not talking about a complete record. We are talking about glimpses, moments, the equivalent of finding a single page from a book or a single frame from a film and trying to imagine the whole story. And yet, archaeologists have become very good at reading these fragments, at understanding what they imply, at recognizing patterns even in sparse data. A single type of stone tool found across a wide region suggests a shared tradition, a way of doing things that was passed from group to group. A sudden shift in the kinds of animal bones found at a site suggests a change in hunting strategy or a change in the environment. The presence of non-local materials, obsidian from a distant volcano, shells from the coast, suggests trade, travel, networks of exchange. These are the methods of archaeology: patient, cautious, respectful of what we don't know. And when we apply these methods to the Americas 12,000 years ago, what do we find? We find a patchwork, not a single story, but many stories, unfolding in different regions at different paces. We find people adapting to a world in flux, experimenting with new strategies, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always learning. We find evidence of movement, of long-distance travel, of groups splitting and merging and splitting again. We find the slow accumulation of knowledge about plants, about animals, about seasons, about stone, about fire, about the land itself. And in a few places, in a few rare moments, we find something more. Something that suggests not just survival, but intention. Not just adaptation, but creation. Not just living, but building something meant to last. Let us look at these moments more closely. One of the central questions about the Americas 12,000 years ago is this: how much continuity was there between the earliest inhabitants and the later civilizations? Were the Maya, the Olmec, the Zapotec, and others building on traditions that stretched back in an unbroken line to the Paleo-Indian peoples? Or were there breaks, disruptions, migrations that swept away older ways of life and replaced them with something new? The answer, as with most things in archaeology, is complicated. There were both continuities and disruptions. Some traditions endured for millennia. Others were lost, replaced, forgotten. The picture is messy, incomplete, full of gaps and ambiguities. But there are threads we can follow. One thread is language. The Maya speak languages that belong to the Mayan family, a group of related languages spoken across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Linguists, by comparing these languages and tracing their evolution, have been able to estimate when they began to diverge from a common ancestor. The current consensus is that Proto-Mayan, the ancestral language, was spoken around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, somewhere in the highlands of Guatemala or the Cucumatanes Mountains. 4,000 to 5,000 years. That's deep. That's older than the earliest Maya cities, older than the first pyramids, older than writing. But it's not 12,000 years. So where were the ancestors of the Maya speakers before that? What languages did they speak? Where did they live? We don't know. Language leaves no fossils. It survives only if it is passed on, spoken continuously from one generation to the next. And even then, it changes, evolves, branches. Tracing a language back beyond a few thousand years is extremely difficult, often impossible. But the fact that Proto-Mayan was spoken 5,000 years ago tells us something important. It tells us that the people who would become the Maya were already in the region, already established, already adapting to the highlands and lowlands of Mesoamerica. And those people, in turn, had ancestors. People who had been in the region for longer still. People who had crossed the threshold of 12,000 years, who had lived through the end of the Ice Age, who had learned the land when it was cooler, wetter, different. Those ancestors are invisible to us now, We cannot hear their language. We cannot know their names. But they were there. And they passed something on. Knowledge, stories, ways of seeing the world, ways of marking time, of understanding the seasons, of relating to the sacred. This is one form of continuity. Not direct, not traceable in a clear line, but real nonetheless. A deep cultural memory embedded in practices, in place names, in stories that were told and retold until they became part of the fabric of a people's identity. The Maya had stories about their origins. They told of migrations from the east, from across the sea. They told of ancestors who came from a place called Seven Caves, a mythical origin point. They told of gods who shaped humans from maize after earlier attempts with mud and wood had failed. These are myths, not historical records. But myths often contain fragments of memory, distorted and transformed by centuries of retelling, but rooted in something real. A migration, a crisis, a moment of transformation. If the Maya told stories of deep origins, of ancestors who came from elsewhere, who wandered, who settled, who learned to grow maize and build cities, perhaps those stories carried echoes of the real journey. The journey that began more than 12,000 years ago, when the first peoples entered the Americas, spread across 2 continents, adapted to every environment from tundra to desert to rainforest to coast. That journey did not end. It continued. It continues still. Another thread we can follow is technology. Specifically, the technology of stone tools. Stone tools are among the most durable artifacts in the archaeological record. They survive when almost everything else is gone. And because different cultures had different ways of making stone tools, different techniques, different styles, different preferences for certain kinds of stone, these tools can tell us a lot about who was where and when and what they were doing. 12,000 years ago, the dominant stone tool tradition in much of North America was what archaeologists call the Clovis culture. Clovis points are distinctive, large, fluted projectile points, carefully crafted, used for hunting. They are found across a vast area from the Great Plains to the southeast and even into Central America. The Clovis culture is usually dated to around 13,000 to 12,800 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age. But Clovis was not the only tradition. In the western United States, there are sites with different tool types, sometimes older than Clovis, sometimes contemporary with it. In South America, there are sites with stone tools that predate Clovis or that show entirely different techniques. Monte Verde in Chile is a site dated to around 14,500 years ago, with evidence of a coastal or riverine adaptation, not a big-game hunting culture like Clovis. What this tells us is that the Americas were not settled by a single wave of migration, with everyone using the same tools, following the same way of life. There were multiple groups, multiple traditions, multiple strategies, and as the climate changed, as the megafauna disappeared, these groups adapted in different ways. In Mesoamerica, the stone tool record from 12,000 years ago is sparse. There are scattered finds. Fluted points have been found in the Valley of Mexico, in the highlands of Guatemala, in Belize. But the context is often unclear. These are surface finds, eroded out of older deposits, no longer in their original layers. Dating them is difficult. What we can say is this: people were present. They were making tools. They were hunting, gathering, moving across the landscape. But we cannot yet say much about who they were, how they were organized, what they believed. The record is too fragmentary. But absence of detail is not absence of presence. And the fact that we have not yet found extensive sites from this period does not mean they did not exist. It may simply mean we have not looked in the right places, or that those places are now inaccessible. Let us turn now to one of the great mysteries of this period, the role of the coast. Today, when we think of ancient settlements, we often think of inland sites, river valleys, highland plateaus, places where the land is stable, where sites are accessible to modern archaeologists. But 12,000 years ago, some of the most attractive places to live would have been along the coasts. Estuaries, river mouths, bays, beaches. These are places where resources are abundant and diverse. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, coastal plants, driftwood for fires and construction. For mobile hunter-gatherers, the coast offers a kind of linear path, a ribbon of abundance that can be followed for thousands of miles. You can move along the shore, stopping wherever resources are plentiful, moving on when they are depleted or when the season changes. This is a strategy that requires relatively little knowledge of the interior. You follow the water, you follow the food, and there is growing evidence that the earliest peoples to enter the Americas may have done exactly this. Not by trudging across an ice-free corridor in the interior of the continent, but by traveling along the Pacific coast, using boats, following the shoreline from Alaska to Chile. This is sometimes called the coastal migration hypothesis, and it has gained significant support in recent years. The problem is, we cannot easily test it, because 12,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower. The coastline was not where it is today. It was farther out, sometimes by many miles, and when the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, those old coastlines were drowned, submerged, covered by hundreds of feet of water. Any settlements, any campsites, any evidence of human presence along those old coasts is now underwater, inaccessible except to underwater archaeologists using specialized equipment. And underwater archaeology is expensive, difficult, and time-consuming. Only a tiny fraction of the submerged coastline has been explored. But the few underwater sites that have been investigated are tantalizing. Off the coast of British Columbia, underwater archaeologists have found stone tools in submerged sediments, evidence of human activity along the ancient shoreline. Off the coast of Florida, in sinkholes and submerged caves, there are human remains and artifacts from the late Pleistocene, preserved in the oxygen-free water. In the Caribbean, as mentioned earlier, there are submerged caves in Belize and the Yucatan where Paleo-Indian peoples ventured, leaving behind bones and tools. These are not coastal settlements exactly, but they are clues, hints that people were living near the coast, interacting with coastal environments, and that much of that evidence is now lost beneath the sea. For Mesoamerica, this is a critical issue. The Caribbean coast, the Gulf Coast, the Pacific coast, all of these would have been attractive places to live 12,000 years ago. And all of them have changed dramatically. Sea levels have risen, shorelines have shifted, river deltas have advanced or retreated. Entire landscapes have been transformed. If there were settlements along those coasts, if there were groups of people living in estuaries, fishing, gathering shellfish, perhaps even experimenting with early forms of aquaculture, we may never find them. They're gone, drowned, erased. This is one of the silent gaps in the record. Not a gap because nothing happened, but a gap because the evidence is beyond our reach. And it leaves us with a frustrating question. How much of the story are we missing? It also raises another question. If coastal resources were so important, and if coastal settlements are now underwater, how do we account for the continuity between the earliest inhabitants and the later civilizations, which were largely inland? Were there separate populations, coastal and inland, with different adaptations and different traditions? Did coastal groups eventually move inland as sea levels rose, bringing their knowledge and skills with them? Or were there always networks of exchange, of interaction between coast and interior, so that knowledge flowed back and forth, crossing ecological boundaries? Again, we don't have clear answers, but we can make educated guesses based on what we know about human behavior in other times and places. People are not isolated. They trade. They marry outside their group. They travel. They share stories, techniques, innovations. Even in the absence of writing, even in small-scale societies, information spreads. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in sudden bursts when a new idea or a new tool proves itself useful. So it is likely that there were connections. That coastal peoples and inland peoples were not entirely separate, but part of a broader network, a web of relationships that spanned the landscape. And within that network, knowledge was being accumulated. Knowledge about the environment, about resources, about how to live, how to thrive, how to pass on what you know to the next generation. This brings us to one of the most important transitions in human history, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. For the Maya, agriculture was fundamental. They grew maize, beans, squash, the three sisters that sustained Mesoamerican civilizations for millennia. They also grew chili peppers, cacao, avocados, and dozens of other crops. Their farming techniques were sophisticated, adapted to the diverse environments of the Maya world. In the lowlands, they practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing small plots in the forest, planting for a few years, then moving on to let the land recover. In the highlands and in some lowland areas, they built terraces, raised fields, irrigation systems. But none of this happened overnight. Agriculture is not invented. It is developed slowly over thousands of years, through trial and error, through patient observation, through the gradual selection of plants with desirable traits. And the process begins not with farming, but with gathering, with knowing which plants are edible, which ones are nutritious, which ones can be stored, which ones grow in which seasons, in which locations. This is knowledge that takes generations to accumulate, knowledge that must be taught, remembered, passed on. 12,000 years ago, the people of Mesoamerica were gatherers. They knew the wild plants of their region intimately. They knew when the fruits ripened, when the seeds were ready, when the roots could be dug. And they were beginning to do something more. They were beginning to intervene, to encourage certain plants, to discourage others, to save seeds from the best specimens, to plant them in favorable locations. This is not yet agriculture. It is something in between. Archaeologists call it plant management or proto-agriculture. And it is one of the most important transitions in human history, because it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without agriculture, there are no permanent villages. Without villages, there is no specialization, no surplus, no leisure time for art, for astronomy, for writing. Without agriculture, there are no cities, no states, no civilizations. And in Mesoamerica, the transition to agriculture took thousands of years. The earliest evidence of plant domestication in Mesoamerica comes from sites like Huila Naquit's cave in Oaxaca, where squash seeds have been found that date to around 10,000 years ago. These squash show signs of human selection. They are larger, with thicker rinds, than their wild ancestors. Someone was choosing which seeds to plant based on which plants produce the best fruit. Beans appear in the archaeological record around 9,000 years ago. Maize, the most important crop of all, is more complicated. The wild ancestor of maize, a grass called teosinte, looks nothing like modern corn. The process of transforming teosinte into maize required centuries of selective breeding. The earliest domesticated maize appears around 9,000 years ago, but it does not become a staple food, the foundation of the diet, until much later, around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. So here is the timeline. 12,000 years ago, people are gathering wild plants. 10,000 years ago, they are beginning to manage certain plants, to experiment with planting. 9,000 years ago, the first domesticated plants appear. 5,000 years ago, agriculture is established and the first permanent villages are forming. 3,000 years ago, maize becomes central to the diet and population begins to grow and the first complex societies emerge. This is a slow process, a gradual accumulation of knowledge and technique, and it unfolds differently in different regions. The highlands are ahead of the lowlands in some respects. The Oaxaca Valley is a center of early innovation. The Maya lowlands lag behind, but eventually catch up and then surpass. But the important point is this: the Maya did not invent agriculture. They inherited it. They inherited a tradition of plant management that went back thousands of years to the very threshold we are exploring. To 12,000 years ago, when people were first learning the rhythms of the land, first noticing which plants were useful, first beginning the long, patient work of domestication. The Maya were heirs to knowledge that had been accumulating for millennia. And that knowledge did not spring up out of nowhere. It was built slowly by generations of people who observed, who experimented, who remembered, who taught their children. And this is where we begin to see the shape of the answer to our original question. What was already there 12,000 years before the Maya? What was there was the foundation, the slow accumulation of ecological knowledge, the beginnings of plant management, the adaptation to diverse environments, the networks of exchange and communication, the first experiments with staying in one place, with returning to the same sites, with building something more permanent. These are not dramatic discoveries. They are not lost cities or ancient technologies. They are the quiet, patient work of learning to live on the land. But they are essential. Without them, nothing that comes later is possible. Let us now turn to a different kind of question. Not what was there, but what might have been there. The realm of hypothesis, of interpretation, of informed speculation. This is where we must be most careful, where the temptation to leap from fragments to fantasies is strongest. But it is also where some of the most interesting thinking is happening, where researchers are pushing the boundaries of what we know, asking new questions, proposing new models. One hypothesis that has gained attention in recent years is the idea that there may have been more social complexity in the Americas during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene than previously thought. Not cities, not states, but perhaps larger and more organized groups than the traditional model of small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers would suggest. The traditional model, based largely on ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherers, assumes that pre-agricultural peoples lived in small groups, maybe 20 to 50 individuals, moving frequently, with relatively egalitarian social structures and limited material culture. This model has been very influential in archaeology. It shapes how we interpret sites, how we think about population density, how we imagine the past, but it may not be entirely accurate. Recent research has shown that some hunter-gatherer societies were much more complex than this model suggests. They had large populations, permanent or semi-permanent settlements, social hierarchies, specialized roles, elaborate rituals. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest, for example, had large villages, complex social structures, monumental art, despite not practicing agriculture. They could do this because they had access to abundant, predictable resources, especially salmon. If some hunter-gatherers could achieve this level of complexity, could others have done so as well? Could there have been groups in the Americas 12,000 years ago or shortly thereafter who were more organized, more settled, more socially complex than we have assumed? There is no definitive evidence for this, but there are hints, suggestive patterns. One is the existence of long-distance trade networks. Even at very early dates, we find materials that traveled hundreds of miles from their source. Obsidian from highland volcanoes shows up in lowland sites. Marine shells show up in inland sites. These materials did not walk there on their own. Someone carried them, either through direct travel or through a chain of exchanges, a network of relationships that spanned regions. Trade networks imply communication, interaction, some level of organization. They suggest that people were not isolated, not moving randomly across the landscape, but part of a larger social fabric. Another hint is the occasional large site. Most Paleo-Indian sites are small, a hearth, a scatter of tools, a few bones. But there are exceptions. Sites that are larger, that show evidence of more intensive occupation, or that contain features that suggest planning and coordination. One example is the Galt site in Texas. It is a Clovis site, dated to around 13,000 years ago, but it is unusually large and dense. Thousands of stone tools, evidence of long-term occupation, possible structures. The sheer quantity of material suggests that this was not just a temporary camp, but a place where people gathered repeatedly, perhaps in large numbers, perhaps for reasons beyond simple subsistence. Why would people gather? For trade, for ceremony, for mate exchange, for the sharing of stories and knowledge, for the renewal of social bonds. These are the kinds of activities that require more than just a small band. They require networks, communities, some level of coordination. Could there have been places like this in Mesoamerica 12,000 years ago? Places where people gathered, not just to survive, but to connect, to share, to build something together. We don't know. We have not found such sites. But that does not mean they did not exist. It may simply mean we have not recognized them, or that they are in places we have not yet explored, or that they are now underwater or buried under later deposits. This is the nature of hypothesis. It is not proof. It is a possibility grounded in patterns we see elsewhere, extended cautiously into the gaps of the record. Another hypothesis concerns the role of ritual and symbolic behavior. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We do not just survive. We create narratives. We mark time. We honor the dead. We create sacred spaces. This is as true of hunter-gatherers as it is of farmers or city dwellers. And there is evidence of symbolic behavior going back deep into the Paleo-Indian period. Burials with grave goods. Ochre, the red pigment used for ritual purposes, found at sites across the Americas. Carved stones. Possible art. In the Andes, at a site called Laricocha, there are cave paintings that may date to 10,000 years ago or older. In Brazil, in the Serra da Capivara, there are rock art sites with images of humans, animals, and abstract designs, some of which may be very ancient, though dating rock art is notoriously difficult. In North America, there are effigy mounds, earthworks shaped like animals, which are much later, only a few thousand years old, but which show a tradition of landscape modification for symbolic purposes. Could similar traditions have existed earlier? Could people 12,000 years ago have been marking the landscape, creating art, building ceremonial spaces? The answer is probably. But proving it is hard. Rock art erodes, wooden structures decay, earth mounds can be worn away by rain and wind, or overgrown by forest, or plowed under by farmers. If there were early ceremonial sites, small and subtle, they might leave no trace at all. But the fact that we see this behavior later in diverse cultures across the Americas suggests that it has deep roots, that the impulse to create sacred space, to mark time, to honor the sacred, is not an innovation of agriculture or cities, but something older, something fundamental to being human. And if the Maya built pyramids and temples, if they oriented their cities to the cosmos, if they turned time itself into a sacred calendar, they were not inventing these ideas from scratch. They were drawing on traditions, on ways of thinking about the world that had deep, deep roots. Roots that might go back 12,000 years, to the threshold, to the moment when the world was changing and people were finding new ways to live in it. One more hypothesis deserves mention. It is the most speculative and the most controversial. It is the idea that there might have been an earlier, unrecognized, complex society in the Americas, one that left few traces but whose influence was felt by later cultures. This is not the same as claiming a lost civilization in the popular sense. Not Atlantis, not ancient aliens, not advanced technology or mystical powers, but rather a society that was more organized, more sophisticated, more influential than we have yet recognized. A society that might have had larger populations, more permanent settlements, more trade, more social complexity than the traditional model allows. The evidence for this is thin. It consists mostly of anomalies, sites that seem too early or too advanced for the standard timeline, tools or techniques that appear suddenly without clear antecedents, myths and oral traditions that speak of ancient peoples, lost cities, forgotten knowledge. These are not proof, they are questions, and most archaeologists are skeptical. The consensus view is that the peopling of the Americas was relatively recent, beginning around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, and that complex societies did not emerge until much later, after the development of agriculture. But consensus is not certainty, and there are a few researchers who argue that we should keep an open mind, that we should be willing to consider the possibility that the story is more complicated, more surprising than we currently think. For example, some researchers have pointed to the genetic evidence. Studies of Native American DNA suggest that there were multiple waves of migration into the Americas, not just one, that there was mixing, divergence, movement, that the picture is not simple. Others have pointed to the linguistic evidence. The diversity of Native American languages is staggering. Hundreds of distinct language families, some with no clear relationship to others. This diversity suggests deep time, long periods of separation and independent development. And still others have pointed to the archaeological evidence from South America, where sites like Monte Verde challenge the Clovis first model, and where the Amazon is revealing a far more complex pre-Columbian history than anyone imagined. But even if we accept that the story is more complex, that there were multiple migrations, that there was more diversity and more sophistication than the old models suggested, we still do not have evidence of a single advanced civilization 12,000 years ago, leaving a legacy for the Maya to inherit. What we have, instead, is a mosaic. Many peoples, many traditions, many experiments unfolding in parallel across two continents. Some of these experiments succeeded. Some failed. Some left traces. Some vanished without a trace. And out of this mosaic, over thousands of years, emerged the complex societies we know from the archaeological record. The Maya, the Olmec, the Zapotec, Teotihuacan, the Andean civilizations, each with its own trajectory, its own innovations, its own debts to the past. This is the honest answer. Not a simple story of a single lost civilization, but a complex story of many peoples, many beginnings, many threads woven together over thousands of years. And the Maya, when they emerged as a distinct culture around 3,000 years ago, were weaving their own threads into that tapestry. They were drawing on the accumulated knowledge of millennia, on the plants that had been domesticated, slowly, patiently, over thousands of years, on the trade networks that crisscrossed Mesoamerica, on the ritual traditions that went back deep into the past, on the ways of seeing the world, of marking time, of honoring the sacred. They were heirs, not to a single civilization, but to a continent's worth of memory. And that memory, in turn, reached back to the threshold. To 12,000 years ago, when the world was changing and people were learning to live in new ways, and the long, slow process of becoming was just beginning. This is the story we are uncovering. Slowly, carefully, one fragment at a time. And it is far richer, far more complex, far more human than any myth of a single lost civilization could ever be. We have walked through fragments, through hints and shadows, through the gaps in the record and the questions they raise. We have stood at the threshold of 12,000 years and looked back, trying to see what was there before the Maya, before the cities, before the pyramids and the calendars and the writing. And what have we found? Not a single answer, not a clear picture, but something more valuable perhaps, a sense of depth, a recognition that the past is deeper, more layered, more complex than we often imagine. That the people who came before us were not simple, not primitive, not less than us. They were fully human, fully capable, fully engaged with the world around them. They were learning, adapting, experimenting, remembering. They were building traditions that would echo forward through time, carried in the knowledge of how to read the sky, how to coax food from the earth, how to mark the sacred, how to gather and remember. The Maya, when they emerged as a distinct civilization, did not appear out of nothing. They were not the first. They were not alone. They were part of a continuum, a chain of inheritance that stretched back through the millennia, all the way to that threshold moment when the ice was melting and the world was being remade. Let us now bring these threads together. Let us connect what we have learned to the Maya themselves and understand how they fit into this long, deep story. The Maya civilization, as we commonly understand it, begins to take recognizable form around 3,000 years ago, in what archaeologists call the pre-classic or formative period. This is when the first permanent villages appear in the Maya lowlands. When people begin to settle in one place, to build houses that are meant to last, to invest in the land through agriculture. When social distinctions begin to emerge, some individuals or families accumulating more wealth, more prestige, more power than others. When the first public architecture appears, platforms, plazas, small pyramids, spaces designed for communal gathering, for ritual, for the display of authority. But this does not happen suddenly. It is not a revolution. It is a gradual process, building on foundations that were already in place. By 3,000 years ago, agriculture was well established in Mesoamerica. Maize had been domesticated for 6,000 years and had been slowly improved, slowly transformed from a marginal grain into a staple crop. Beans and squash were being grown alongside maize. Villages were scattered across the highlands and beginning to spread into the lowlands. Trade networks linked the Pacific coast, the Gulf Coast, the highlands, and the emerging Maya region. Obsidian, jade, cacao, shells, these precious materials moved along these networks, connecting distant communities, creating relationships of exchange and obligation. The Maya did not invent any of this. They inherited it, but they took what they inherited and made it their own. They adapted it to the specific environments of the Maya lowlands, the dense rainforest, the seasonal rains, the limestone bedrock with its hidden cenotes and underground rivers. They developed their own styles of pottery, their own architectural forms, their own ways of organizing society, and they began to do something remarkable. They began to keep track, to record, to write down what they knew. The Maya script is one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient Americas. It is a complex system combining phonetic signs and logograms, capable of recording not just numbers and dates, but also names, histories, stories, prophecies. It allowed the Maya to externalize memory, to make knowledge permanent, to communicate across generations. But writing does not appear out of nowhere. It is the culmination of a long process of symbolic thinking, of visual representation, of the need to record and communicate information. And that process, too, has deep roots. The earliest known writing in Mesoamerica is not Maya. It is Olmec, or possibly Zapotec, and it dates to around 3,000 years ago, roughly contemporary with the earliest Maya settlements. But even before writing, there are signs of symbolic notation, carved symbols on stone, notches on bones, possibly representing counts or calendars, the use of specific colors or materials in ritual contexts, each carrying its own meaning. These are the precursors of writing, the early experiments in making thought visible, in translating memory into marks that can be seen, read, preserved. And if we trace this process back, we find that it too connects to that deep past, to the people who carved images on cave walls, to those who used ochre in burials, transforming the red earth into a symbol of life, of blood, of the sacred, to those who arranged stones in patterns, who oriented structures toward the solstice, who watched the stars and saw not just light, but meaning. The Maya, when they developed their writing, their calendars, their astronomical observations, were drawing on a tradition of symbolic thought that was ancient even to them. A tradition that might reach back, in some form, to the very threshold we have been exploring. Consider the Maya calendar, or rather, calendars, plural, because the Maya used several interlocking systems. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred calendar used for divination, for naming children, for timing rituals. The Hab, a 365-day solar calendar tracking the agricultural year. And the Long Count, a linear count of days from a creation date far in the mythical past, used for recording historical events and projecting into the deep future. These calendars are sophisticated. They require careful observation of the sun, the moon, the planets. They require mathematics, the concept of zero, the ability to calculate and predict. They represent centuries, perhaps millennia, of accumulated astronomical knowledge. But that knowledge did not begin with the Maya. The idea of tracking time, of dividing the year into meaningful segments, of watching the sky for patterns, these ideas are universal. They appear in cultures around the world at different times, in different forms. Because the sky is the most reliable clock we have. The sun rises and sets. The moon waxes and wanes. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. If you watch long enough, if you pay attention, you begin to see the patterns. The solstices, when the sun reaches its northernmost and southernmost points. The equinoxes, when day and night are equal. The heliacal rising of certain stars, marking the seasons. Hunter-gatherers understand these patterns. They have to. Their survival depends on knowing when to move, when to hunt, when to gather. The return of the salmon, the ripening of berries, the migration of caribou. All of these are tied to the calendar of the sky, so the impulse to watch the stars, to track time, to find meaning in the heavens, this is not unique to agricultural civilizations. It is older, deeper. It is part of being human, of trying to understand our place in the cosmos. What the Maya did was formalize this knowledge. They turned observation into system. They developed notation, mathematics, writing. They built structures aligned to astronomical events, temples where the sun would strike a certain point on the equinox, creating a shadow serpent that appeared to descend the pyramid steps, a stunning visual demonstration of their understanding of cycles, of time, of the relationship between earth and sky. But the foundation, the watching, the tracking, the sense that the sky matters, that foundation was already there, had been there for thousands of years, had been there, perhaps, since the very beginning, since the first people looked up at the stars and wondered what they meant. This is what it means to say that the Maya were heirs. They inherited a world already shaped by human presence, human knowledge, human memory. They inherited plants that had been domesticated over millennia. They inherited trade networks that stretched back centuries. They inherited ways of seeing the world, of relating to the sacred, of organizing society, and they took all of this and built something new, something distinctly Maya, something that would endure for over 2,000 years, through the rise and fall of cities, through periods of prosperity and collapse, through transformation and continuity. But they did not build it from nothing. They built it on the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, reaching back to that threshold, to 12,000 years ago, when the world was young and people were just beginning to learn how to live in it. Let us speak now of what we do not know, of the gaps that remain, of the questions that may never be fully answered. We do not know the names of the people who lived 12,000 years ago. We do not know their languages, their songs, their stories. We do not know what they believed about the world, about life and death, about the sacred. We do not know how they organized themselves, who led them, how decisions were made. We do not know most of what they knew, the detailed ecological knowledge, the medicinal plants, the navigation routes, the seasonal patterns, the animal behaviors. All of this was carried in memory, passed from generation to generation through teaching, through imitation, through story. And when those lineages were broken, by disease, by displacement, by cultural transformation, much of that knowledge was lost. We do not know how many sites are still undiscovered, buried beneath rainforest, hidden under volcanic ash, drowned beneath the rising seas. We do not know how much of the story we are missing because the evidence simply did not survive. Wood and fiber, rope and leather, paint and plaster, all of these decay, leaving no trace. Even stone can be recycled, reused in later constructions, erasing the earlier layers. We do not know the full extent of the networks that connected people across vast distances. We have hints. The obsidian that traveled hundreds of miles, the shells that moved from coast to interior, but we do not know the specifics. Who carried these materials? How were they exchanged? What stories were told along these routes? What ideas, what innovations traveled alongside the goods? We do not know how many times people experimented with sedentism, with architecture, with ritual spaces, only to abandon them, to move on, to try something different. Not every experiment succeeds, not every village lasts, not every tradition endures. The archaeological record shows us the successes, or at least the sites that happen to survive. But for every site we find, there may be dozens that left no trace, or that we have simply not found yet. We do not know what was lost, what knowledge, what stories, what ways of being in the world disappeared without record, without memory. Every time a language dies, every time a tradition is broken, every time a place is abandoned and forgotten, something is lost. And over 12,000 years, much has been lost. This is the nature of deep time. The farther back we look, the less we can see. Not because the past was emptier, but because time itself is erosive. It wears away evidence. It blurs details. It leaves only the most durable traces. And yet, even in the gaps, even in the silences, there is meaning. The gaps tell us something. They tell us that the story is larger than what we can reconstruct. They tell us to be humble, to acknowledge what we don't know, to resist the temptation to fill the silence with speculation or fantasy. The honest position is to say, we are standing at the edge of a vast darkness and we have a small lamp. We can see a little way into that darkness. We can make out shapes, shadows, patterns, but most of it remains beyond our sight, and that is okay. That is the condition of all historical knowledge. We work with what we have. We build our understanding carefully, provisionally, always ready to revise when new evidence appears. And new evidence does appear, regularly. Underwater archaeologists discover submerged sites. LIDAR technology reveals ancient structures hidden beneath jungle canopy. New dating techniques refine our chronologies. Genetic studies reveal unsuspected migrations and mixings. Linguistic research traces the deep relationships between languages. Each of these discoveries adds a little more light, pushes the darkness back a little farther. But the darkness will never be fully illuminated. And perhaps it shouldn't be. Perhaps the mystery is part of the value. Perhaps the sense of standing at a threshold, looking back into deep time, wondering what lies beyond our vision. Perhaps that sense of wonder is itself important. It reminds us that history is not a closed book, not a settled matter, but an ongoing inquiry, an endless conversation between past and present. The Maya themselves understood this. Their creation myths speak of earlier worlds, earlier attempts at making humans, earlier ages that ended in flood or fire or transformation. They speak of gods who debate, who experiment, who try and fail and try again. They speak of time as cyclical, as moving in great rounds, with endings that are also beginnings. These are not literal histories, but they are profound recognitions of the deep past, of the sense that the world is old, that it has been shaped and reshaped, that we are part of a story that is larger and longer than any individual or any civilization. When the Maya looked at the ruins of earlier cities, Olmec, sites abandoned long before the Maya Classic period, they recognized them as sacred places, as remnants of an earlier age. They did not always understand who had built them. They attributed them to gods, to giants, to ancestors. But they recognized that they were standing in a landscape that had been inhabited, shaped, remembered for a very long time. And we are doing the same. We are looking at the traces left by the Maya and by those who came before them, and we are trying to understand, trying to piece together the story, trying to honor the depth and complexity of the past. We are standing at the threshold of 12,000 years, and we are looking back, and we are asking, what was already there? And the answer is, more than we will ever fully know. But enough to fill us with wonder, enough to make us realize that the story of human presence in the Americas is deeper, richer, more layered than we once thought. Enough to understand that the Maya were not the beginning, but a flowering, a culmination, a brilliant expression of traditions that had roots stretching back to the very edge of memory. Let us end where we began, with a number, with a threshold, with a doorway in time. 12,000 years. It is not a magic number. It is not the moment when everything changed. It is simply a point on a continuum, a marker we have chosen because it stands at a moment of transition, the end of the Ice Age, the beginning of the Holocene, the moment when the world as we know it began to take shape. But it is also a reminder that before this moment there was also time, also people, also life unfolding, stories being lived, knowledge being accumulated. And after this moment, the story continued, slowly, patiently. Generation after generation, people learned, adapted, built, remembered. The Maya, when they rose to prominence 2,000 years ago, were standing on the shoulders of ancestors they themselves might not have fully understood. They told stories of origins, of migrations, of gods who shaped the world. But beneath those stories, invisible to them as it is mostly invisible to us, was the long chain of transmission, the passing of knowledge from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, from one generation to the next. How to read the sky, how to grow maize, how to carve jade, how to mix plaster, how to organize a village, how to honor the dead, how to mark time, how to remember. This is the true inheritance, not monuments or artifacts, though those are valuable, but knowledge itself, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, distilled into practice, into tradition, into the fabric of culture. And when the Maya cities fell, when the classic period ended in what is sometimes called the Maya collapse, the knowledge did not disappear. The people did not vanish. They continued. They transformed. They adapted as their ancestors had always done. They moved to new locations. They created new forms of social organization. They preserved what they could of the old ways while inventing new ones, and their descendants are still here. The Maya did not disappear into history. There are millions of Maya people alive today, speaking Maya languages, maintaining traditions, connecting to the land, to the stories, to the memory that stretches back through time. They too are heirs. Heirs to 12,000 years of human presence in the Americas. Heirs to the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. Heirs to a story that is still being told. For us, looking back from the present, the story of 12,000 years before the Maya is a story of fragments and shadows. We see glimpses, we infer patterns, We make educated guesses. We stand at the threshold and peer into the darkness, trying to make out shapes, trying to understand. But we should not mistake our limited vision for the fullness of what was. The past was as rich, as complex, as full of life as the present. People loved and grieved, hoped and feared, created and destroyed. They laughed, they sang, they told stories around fires. They watched their children grow. They grew old, they died, and their descendants carried on, carrying forward some of what they knew, losing some, inventing new things. This is the pattern of all human history. Loss and continuity, innovation and tradition, the slow accumulation of knowledge and the sudden disruption of forgetting. We cannot recover it all. We cannot know it all, but we can honor it. We can recognize that the people who came before us were not lesser, not simpler, not less human. They were us in a different time, and they deserve our respect, our attention, our willingness to sit with mystery rather than filling it with fantasy. The story of 12,000 years before the Maya is not a story of a lost super-civilization, of ancient astronauts, of secret knowledge. It is a story of people learning to live on the land, people adapting to change, people building traditions, people remembering, and those people, in their slow, patient accumulation of knowledge, in their careful transmission of what they learned, in their adaptation to a changing world, laid the foundations upon which the Maya would eventually build their cities, their calendars, their script, their astronomy, their art. The Maya were not the first, but they were among those who learned to turn memory into systems, to externalize knowledge in writing, in architecture, in the movements of time itself. They took what they inherited and made it visible, permanent, enduring. And in doing so, they left us a gift, a window into the past, a way of understanding that the story is deeper than we thought, that the chain of inheritance stretches back farther than we can see. That 12,000 years ago and long before, there were already people here, living, thinking, creating, remembering. We stand at the threshold, we look back, and we see not a void, but a beginning, not emptiness, but presence, not mystery as absence, but mystery as invitation. An invitation to wonder, to question, to imagine, to honor what we don't know even as we carefully, patiently work to learn more. 12,000 years before the Maya, there was something already there, not a single civilization, not a simple answer, but a world in motion, people in transition, knowledge being born, being tested, being passed on. And from that threshold, from that doorway in time, a long chain of memory stretches forward, link by link, generation by generation, all the way to the Maya and beyond them to the present day. We are not at the end of this story, we are still in the middle of it. Still learning, still discovering, still asking questions. The darkness at the edge of the lamp's light is vast, and we will never illuminate all of it. But we can keep moving forward, keep searching, keep listening to what the fragments have to tell us. And we can remember that we too are part of this chain. That we too are heirs to the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years. That we too will pass something on to those who come after us. What will we pass on? What will we choose to remember? What will we choose to honor? These are not idle questions. They matter. Because the past is not dead. It lives in us, in the choices we make, in the stories we tell, in the knowledge we preserve or allow to slip away. The people who lived 12,000 years ago could not have imagined us, could not have known that we would be here, trying to understand them, trying to piece together their story from the few fragments they left behind. but they lived their lives fully. They did their best to survive, to flourish, to pass on what they knew. And in doing so, they made us possible. We owe them the same. We owe it to those who will come after us to preserve what we can, to honor what we know, to be honest about what we don't know, and to keep searching, keep questioning, keep wondering. The threshold of 12,000 years is not a wall. It is a doorway, and it stands open, inviting us in, inviting us to look, to listen, to learn. We may never cross that threshold fully. We may never step into that distant past and see it clearly in all its richness and complexity. But we can stand at the edge. We can peer in. We can honor the darkness and the light, the known and the unknown, the fragments and the silences. And we can carry forward what we learn. We can add our own small light to the lamp. We can pass on the story, incomplete as it is, to the next generation. And they, in turn, can add their light, their questions, their discoveries. This is how knowledge grows. Slowly, patiently, one generation building on another, one question leading to the next, one fragment connecting to another, until slowly, over time, a picture begins to emerge. Not complete, never complete, but clearer, richer, deeper. 12,000 years before the Maya, there was already a world, already people, already the slow work of becoming, of learning, of building something that would endure. The Maya were heirs to that world, and we in turn are heirs to the Maya and to all who came before them. The chain stretches back into the darkness, and it stretches forward into the future, into a time we cannot see, where people we will never meet will stand at their own thresholds, looking back, asking their own questions, honoring their own ancestors. May they find us worthy. May they find that we honored the past, that we preserved what we could, that we were honest about what we didn't know, and that we kept the lamp burning, however small its light. 12,000 years, a threshold, a doorway, a beginning, and beyond it, in the darkness, the quiet presence of those who came before. Waiting, watching, reminding us that the story is deeper than we know, that the past is not empty, that memory matters, that we are not alone. We're part of something larger, something older, something that began long ago at the edge of memory and continues still. And that is enough. That is more than enough.